The neighbors of Wind River Basin were a practical people shaped by a landscape that offered beauty without mercy. They had learned through seasons of hard lessons and harder winters that survival in Wyoming Territory demanded a certain kind of rigidity, a faithfulness to methods that had already proven themselves against the cold. When a woman arrived alone in the late summer of 1882 and claimed 160 acres of windswept grassland on the eastern slope of the basin, the community extended the courteous indifference they reserved for newcomers. She would either prove herself by autumn or she would not. The land had a way of making that determination faster than any jury of neighbors could. Her name was Clara Holt. She was 28 years old and she arrived on a Tuesday morning in August with a single horse, a worn leather saddlebag, a bedroll strapped behind the saddle, and a canvas sack that clinked softly when she set it down, the sound of a few tools, not enough of them. Edwin Marsh, whose property bordered the western edge of her claim, watched her ride in from the ridge above his south pasture. He had been mending a section of fence line since dawn, and he paused with a staple between his fingers and studied the figure moving across the open ground below. She was small in the saddle, straight-backed, unhurried. She stopped at the surveyor's stake that marked the northeast corner of the claim, dismounted without hesitation, and stood for a long moment looking south across the land that was now legally hers. Edwin could not see her face from that distance. He could only see the way she stood, not like someone overwhelmed by what she was looking at, but like someone who had already made a decision and was simply confirming it. He drove the staple home and went back to work. Whatever she planned to do with 160 acres of grass and wind and clay soil, it was her business. What Clara Holt planned to do, as the Basin would discover over the following weeks, was not build a cabin. She did not haul timber from the mountains to the north. She did not negotiate with the sawmill operator and lander for cut lumber. She did not dig a foundation in the open ground the way every homesteader before her had done, staking out a rectangular footprint and rising above the earth with walls and a roof and a chimney tall enough to be seen from the road. Instead, on the third day after her arrival, she began walking her land in a slow and deliberate grid, moving back and forth across the slopes with a length of wire in her hand that she pushed into the ground every few yards and then pulled up slowly, pressing her palm against the end that had been underground. Edwin saw her doing this on the morning of the fourth day when he rode out to check on his cattle in the east pasture. He reined in his horse at the fence line and watched her for a while. She was working the south-facing slope of a low hill, the kind of gradual rise that broke the flat of the basin just enough to create a natural windbreak on the north side, while the southern face caught whatever sun the Wyoming sky offered. She would push the wire down, wait, withdraw it, press it to her palm, then make a small mark in the soil with the toe of her boot and move on. Edwin had no framework for what she was measuring. He assumed, with the tolerance of a man who had seen eccentric homesteaders come and go, that she was checking for something in the soil, looking for a spring maybe, or testing drainage. He rode on without speaking to her. It was not until the following week, when the digging started, that the Basin began to pay real attention. Clara had chosen her spot on the south face of the hill with a precision that would not become apparent to anyone else for months. The slope angled at roughly 15 degrees, enough to shed water naturally away from any structure built into it, but gradual enough that excavation was manageable for a single person working with a pickaxe and a spade. She began at the point she had marked, cutting into the hillside in a rectangle approximately 12 feet wide, then driving that cut straight back into the earth rather than down into it. She was not digging a cellar. She was digging a room. Edwin found out from his wife Martha, who had heard it from the woman at the dry goods counter in Lander, who had heard it from the freighter who had passed Clara's claim on the road south. The word that traveled back to Edwin was simple and unadorned. She's digging into the hill, not building on it, into it. Martha had looked at Edwin across the supper table when she said it, and there was something in her expression, not quite alarm, not quite pity, that settled into the space between them like a third presence at the meal. She lost her husband, Martha said, as though this explained something. Edwin chewed his bread and said nothing. He had lost neighbors to Wyoming winters before. He did not think widowhood explained what Clara Holt was doing on that hillside, but he had no better explanation to offer. Russell Crane heard about it in Lander on a Saturday at the hardware counter, where he was ordering hinges for a cabin he was building on the north end of the Basin. Crane was 43 years old and had built more structures in Wind River Basin than any other man working in wood. He had put up 41 cabins by his own count, plus 3 barns, 2 schoolhouses, and a church that stood 6 years before lightning took it. He knew timber the way a physician knows the body by function and by failure, by the specific ways each species of wood responded to cold and to wet and to the slow settling of the earth beneath it. When he heard that a woman was digging herself into the side of a hill instead of building above ground, he felt the particular irritation of a craftsman confronted with a problem being solved badly. He rode out on the following Monday with no invitation and no announcement. He found Clara on the hillside deeper into the cut, now hauling loosened earth out in a shallow wooden box she was dragging by a rope. She had made remarkable progress. The opening in the hillside was already large enough that she had to duck slightly to work inside it, and the pile of excavated clay and stone beside the entrance was substantial, the evidence of days of sustained labor. Crane dismounted and walked to the edge of the excavation without speaking. He looked at the depth of the cut, at the walls of earth and clay, at the ceiling of compacted soil overhead, held in place by nothing yet except its own weight. Clara emerged from the opening, pulling the box behind her, and stood up. She looked at Crane without surprise, as though she had expected someone would come eventually. She was covered in reddish clay dust from her collar to her boots, her hair tied back under a cloth, her hands rough and darkened with work. Crane looked at the opening, then at her, then back at the opening. "This isn't a cabin." His words came flat and certain. "This is a grave you're digging. You'll freeze or suffocate before February." Clara brushed clay from the back of one hand. "I appreciate you coming to say so." She reached down and picked up her pickaxe. Crane stood for a moment longer, waiting perhaps for her to argue, or to ask his opinion, or to show some uncertainty he could work with. She did none of these things. She ducked back into the opening, and the sound of the pick against earth resumed steady and unhurried, and Crane stood outside in the late summer wind with the basin spread out behind him and felt the strange experience of being thoroughly dismissed by someone who had not said a single unkind word to him. He rode back to Lander in a mood he could not quite name. The community's reaction to Clara's project moved through a predictable progression. First came the assumption that she was simply confused, that she would recognize the inadequacy of what she was building and abandon it before winter arrived. Then came the jokes, quiet at first, and then less so, the kind that circulate through a small community, the way weather moves through a valley, touching everyone eventually. The woman at the dry goods store mentioned that she had heard the widow Holt was building herself a prairie dog mound. The men at the feed store thought this was funny. Even those who did not find it funny did not find it worth defending. Norman Patton was not a cruel man. He was a farmer of modest success and genuine goodwill. And when he rode past Clara's claim in the second week of September and saw the progress she had made, the opening now clearly defined a rough front wall of stacked fieldstone beginning to take shape, the roof line marked out with stakes, he felt something that was partly admiration and partly the specific distress of watching someone make a mistake they could not yet see. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked up the slope. Clara was mortaring stone with a clay and sand mixture she had made in a wooden trough beside the excavation. She looked up when she heard his boots on the hillside. Patton removed his hat, which was a gesture he reserved for church and for moments of real seriousness. "Mrs. Holt," his voice came careful and slow, "I want you to know that when winter gets difficult, my storage barn stays above freezing most nights. There's room enough. I've put up families before." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm not suggesting anything about what you're building. I only want you to know the offer stands." Clara set down her trowel and looked at Patton steadily. "That's a kind thing to say." Her voice was even. "I hope I won't need it." Patton nodded and put his hat back on and walked down the slope to his horse. He meant every word he had said, and he knew it had landed wrong somehow, though he could not have explained exactly how. Clara watched him ride away and then stood for a moment with her trowel in her hand, looking out across the basin to the south where the mountains were still brown and clear against the sky. The offer of the storage barn had been genuine. She understood that. She also understood that it had been offered by a man who had already decided she would fail, and that even his kindness carried within it the assumption of her defeat. That assumption she thought was going to be harder to live with than the winter itself. She picked up her trowel and went back to the wall. The material she was working with had cost her by the end of September $15.40. The fieldstone she had gathered from the exposed outcroppings along the creek bed, a quarter-mile to the east, loading it onto a flat drag she had fashioned from 2 poles and a section of old canvas, hauling it up the slope with her horse in the mornings before the heat of the day made the clay dust worse. The wooden railroad ties that would support her ceiling she had obtained through a negotiation she had conducted with the foreman of a work gang laying track 8 miles to the south. She had offered 4 days of cooking for 12 men in exchange for 18 ties that were surplus to their current section. The foreman, a weathered man named Hooper, who had seen stranger trades in 20 years of rail work, had accepted without discussion. Clara had cooked 4 days of beans and cornbread and salt pork over an open fire in the rail camp, and then loaded the ties onto a borrowed wagon and brought them to her claim. The clay mortar she mixed herself from the excavated material, adding sand she had sifted from the creek bank to improve its binding quality. The single window smallets frame cut from a single plank, faced due south, positioned at a height and angle, she had calculated over several evenings, sitting on the slope with a stick, and watching where the low winter sun would fall if she held the stick at different heights. She had no instruments for this. She used the stick in the sun and what she knew. What she knew had come to her from her husband. Thomas Holt had not been a farmer or a carpenter. He had been the kind of man who thought about how things work not in an abstract or academic way, but in the specific and practical way of someone who has to make things work in conditions that do not favor easy solutions. He had grown up in the hill country of western Pennsylvania, the son of a millwright, and he had spent his childhood watching his father solve problems that no textbook addressed by looking carefully at what nature was already doing and then working with it rather than against it. Thomas had absorbed this approach without knowing he was absorbing it the way children learn the most important things, not through instruction, but through sustained observation of someone they love. He had worked at the mill for 11 years, the last 4 as its primary operator, responsible for its maintenance and for the training of younger workers. Clara had met him at a church social in the fall of 1876, and she had fallen in love with him. She would later think not because of anything dramatic, but because of the way he paid attention. He paid attention to everything, to the sound a piece of machinery made when it was about to fail, to the way a stream changed its behavior in different seasons, to the specific quality of light in different hours of the day. On winter evenings, he would talk to Clara about things he had noticed, things that struck him as worth understanding. One of these things was the temperature of the earth. He had noticed working in the mill's lower level, which was dug partially into a hillside, that the underground portion of the building maintained a temperature that did not follow the temperature outside. In deep winter, when the air above ground was bitter and the surface of the creek froze solid, the underground room stayed cool but never froze. In midsummer, when the mill floor above was sweltering, the lower room was comfortable. He had talked about this with Clara on several occasions, not as a curiosity, but as a principle. The earth, he explained, was a thermal reservoir, absorbing heat slowly through the warm months and releasing it slowly through the cold ones. At depths of 6 feet or more, the ground maintained a temperature that varied little across the seasons, somewhere in the range of 45 to 50 degrees, depending on the latitude and local conditions. It was not warm by any comfortable standard, but it was reliably above freezing. And in a structure built into it rather than above it, that baseline was not nothing. It was a foundation that the air outside, however cold, could not easily undermine. Thomas had been killed in March of 1880. The accident was not dramatic, a timber shift during a repair that should have been straightforward, the kind of thing that happened in mills with a statistical regularity that the industry had come to treat as an acceptable cost of doing business. He was 32 years old. Clara was 26. There were no children. She had her husband's tools and his books, in the particular inheritance of someone who has spent years in close conversation with a thinking person, a mind trained to look at the world in a certain way, a habit of observation that does not dissolve when the person who taught it is gone. She had stayed in Pennsylvania for 2 years after Thomas died, working as a seamstress and then as a bookkeeper for a hardware merchant, and she had been competent at both and deeply unhappy at neither. What she felt was not grief exactly, or not only grief, it was a kind of constriction, the sensation of a life narrowing around her while the world outside continued at its usual scale. Wyoming had been a decision made over the course of a long winter. research through correspondence with a land agent in Cheyenne, and a careful reading of everything she could find about the territory's conditions and opportunities. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres to anyone willing to live on and improve the land for 5 years. Clara had determined that she was willing. What she had not fully anticipated until she arrived and spent her first days walking the basin was the near total absence of timber. The cottonwoods along the creek were too sparse and too valuable as windbreaks to fell for lumber. The pine forest began only in the mountains to the north, a distance that made hauling timber a serious undertaking even for a family with a team of horses and a wagon. For a woman alone, it was effectively impossible at any scale that would produce enough wood for a winter's fuel. The traditional approach to a Wyoming winter, she had quickly understood, required between 3 and 6 cords of firewood for a single season. There was no version of her circumstances in which she could cut, haul, and split that volume of wood. This was not a problem she had fully solved before she arrived. It was a problem she had arrived carrying, and it was the land itself that had handed her the answer. The land and Thomas's voice in her memory, describing the underground room at the mill and the temperature that never quite reached freezing. On the evening of this day, she chose her site on the south-facing slope. Clara had sat on the hillside until the light failed, pushing the probe wire into the soil at various points around the marked location, and pressing its tip to the inside of her wrist, where the skin was thin enough to register temperature with some accuracy. 6 inches down, cold, nearly as cold as the air. 2 feet down, noticeably less cold. 3 feet down, she could hold the wire against her wrist without discomfort. She could not reach 6 feet with a hand probe, but the gradient she was measuring told her what she needed to know, confirmed what Thomas had explained years earlier in the lamplight of their kitchen. The heat was there, banked into the earth like coals into ash, patient and stable, and indifferent to the wind that was cutting across the basin above her. She had sat in the gathering dark and felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Not happiness exactly, something more durable than that. By the middle of October, the structure was taking its final shape, and even those who had been most certain it would amount to nothing were compelled by the evidence of its existence to make more specific objections. Crane returned a second time again, uninvited, bringing with him a carpenter named Webb from Lander, who shared his doubts and his interest. They stood outside the nearly completed structure, and Crane produced a measuring tape and went to work on the front wall with the systematic attention of a man building a case. The wall rose to just over 6 feet at its highest point, constructed of stacked fieldstone, mortared with clay, with the small south-facing window set 2 feet from the left side and angled slightly downward from the inside to the outside, a detail Crane noted with a furrowed expression because it was not accidental. The roof was invisible from the front, buried under 2 feet of compacted sod that extended across the top of the hillside above. The entrance was a low door set slightly to the right of center, its frame made from 2 of the railroad ties. The door itself hung on heavy iron hinges Clara had purchased in Lander. A narrow flue barely 4 inches across emerged from the hillside above, and to the right of the door, at an angle, not the vertical chimney of a conventional cabin, but a diagonal pipe that rose through the earth above the living space and exited the hillside 6 feet back from the front wall. Crane looked at the flue for a long time. Too narrow, his assessment came blunt and final. Too much resistance. Smoke will back up into the living space. She'll suffocate the first time she tries to heat it properly. Webb nodded in agreement and wrote something in a small notebook. What neither of them understood, because neither of them had been inside, was that the flue's narrow diameter and diagonal rise were not design flaws. They were the design. A wide chimney draws aggressively, pulling warm air out of a room as fast as a fire can produce it, demanding constant fuel to replace what is lost. Clara's flue was sized to produce a gentle draw sufficient to clear the smoke of a small, slow-burning fire, the kind of fire intended not to heat a room from the outside, but to supplement heat that the room was already retaining through its walls and floor and ceiling. The flue was narrow because the fire was meant to be small. The fire was meant to be small because the room was not meant to lose the heat it accumulated. This logic was not invisible, but it required a frame of reference that neither Crane nor Webb possessed, because they had spent their careers building structures whose fundamental relationship with the environment was adversarial walls to keep cold out fires, to force warmth in chimneys, to remove the evidence of that struggle. The idea that a structure might work with the Earth's existing thermal properties, rather than against the sky's existing cold, was not part of their vocabulary of construction. It was not part of anyone's vocabulary in Wind River Basin in the fall of 1882. Clara was aware of this. She did not try to explain it to Crane or to Webb. She thanked them for coming and answered their specific questions honestly, and did not defend herself against assessments she had already tested against reality and found wanting. Crane rode away convinced of his conclusions. Clara went back inside and continued fitting the sleeping platform into the back wall, a shelf of packed earth faced with a section of pine board wide enough for a bedroll positioned at the depth in the hillside where the ambient temperature of the surrounding soil was at its most stable. The last week of October brought the first real cold, not the killing cold that would come later, but the advance notice of it, the kind of nights where breath showed in the air by 9 o'clock, and the water in the bucket on the porch developed a thin skin of ice by morning. Edwin Marsh spent 2 days of that week splitting firewood, adding to the stack beside his cabin, with the mechanical urgency of a man who has been through enough Wyoming winters to feel in his body what the sky was communicating. He had, by his count, 4 cords already split and stacked enough for a normal winter. Maybe enough for a hard one if he was careful. He added half a cord more and felt marginally better. He could see Clara's claim from the ridge above his east pasture, and on the morning of the last day of October, he rode up to check on a water trough and paused on the ridge and looked south to where her hillside lay. The structure was complete now. He could see that from this distance. The front wall stood pale and solid against the hillside, and the slope above it was smoothed and even where the sod had been laid. It looked nothing like a cabin. It looked from this distance like an unusually organized section of hillside, like the land had been tidied rather than built upon. He stood there for a while longer than he intended, then he rode down to see to the trough. On the 3rd of November, a freighter named Carson, who regularly ran the road between Lander and the Southern Claims, told anyone who would listen that he had passed the whole place at midday and seen only a small pile of firewood outside the door, perhaps a quarter cord, perhaps less. This information traveled through the basin with the efficiency that only genuinely alarming news achieves. A quarter cord. For a Wyoming winter, in a structure dug into a hillside with a flue the size of a man's forearm. Martha Marsh heard it at the dry goods store and came home troubled. She told Edwin over supper, and Edwin sat with it for a moment and then said, "She knows what she's doing or she doesn't. Either way, we'll know by December." Martha looked at him. "That's a cold way to think about a neighbor." Edwin said nothing. He was not cold about it. He was simply doing what the Basin had taught him to do, which was to wait for events to demonstrate what opinion had not settled. He had opinions about Clara Holt's structure. He kept them to himself because they were contradictory in ways he could not quite resolve. Part of him agreed with Crane that it was inadequate. Part of him could not stop thinking about the way the hillside looked from the ridge, not like a failure, but like something that had been thought about carefully. These two parts had not yet reached a conclusion, and until they did, silence seemed more honest than noise. The structure's interior, which only Clara had seen, contained certain features that would not become apparent to the Basin's community until winter made them undeniable. The floor was packed, earth smoothed and hardened with a mixture of clay and fine gravel that had dried to a surface nearly as firm as wood. Clara had shaped it herself over the course of several days, working the mixture with a flat stone and a length of board, removing high spots and filling low ones, then allowing each layer to cure before applying the next. The result was not beautiful, but it was even and sealed a surface that conducted the Earth's ambient temperature upward into the room without the cold drafts that came through gaps in plank flooring. The walls were the hillside itself, compacted clay and sandstone, in roughly equal proportion with no airspace behind them, no gap through which cold air could infiltrate. Clara had smoothed the interior surfaces with a thin coat of the same clay and sand mortar she had used on the front wall, both to seal any small cracks that had opened during the excavation and to provide a surface that absorbed and held heat. The ceiling, the underside of the sod roof, was insulated by 2 feet of earth, the sod above that, and then the slope of the hillside continuing above it. The cold could reach it from above only by penetrating all of that material, and the ground above the living space was not frozen ground in winter. It was ground insulated by its own surface cover, and by the heat rising from the room below held in a thermal equilibrium that the outside air could not quickly disturb. The firebox she had installed in the left wall was small, perhaps 18 inches across and 12 inches deep, built of fire brick she had transported carefully from Lander in a wooden crate. It was not designed to be the primary source of heat for the room. It was designed to be a supplement to raise the interior temperature from the Earth's baseline, approximately 48 degrees at this depth and location, as nearly as Clara could calculate up to something comfortable for human habitation. The difference she needed to bridge was not 50 degrees below zero to 60 degrees above. It was 48 degrees to 65. The firebox existed to close that gap, and it needed far less fuel to do so than any fireplace in any cabin in the basin, because it was not fighting the cold from scratch. The window's positioning was not decorative. In the winter months, the sun in Wyoming Territory arcs low across the southern sky, never climbing to the height it reaches in summer. Clara had observed this carefully and positioned the window so that in the 6 weeks around the winter solstice, the low winter sun would enter the room at a direct angle for approximately 4 hours each clear day, falling across the floor and the back wall, and depositing solar heat directly into the room's thermal mass. In summer, the sun's higher angle meant it would not enter through the same window at all, preventing overheating. This was not accident. This was Thomas's principle applied work with what the environment is doing rather than against it. She moved into the structure on the first day of November. She brought her bedroll, her tools, her canvas sack of provisions, and the leather saddlebag that contained, among other things, Thomas's small notebook, 20 pages of his careful handwriting, observations about materials and temperatures, and the behavior of structures he had encountered in his work, interspersed with calculations and occasional diagrams. She had read it many times. She did not need to read it again. She kept it because it was his, and because some things are worth carrying, not for their utility, but for what they mean. The first night, she did not light the firebox. The temperature outside dropped to 26 degrees before midnight. Clara lay on the sleeping platform in her bedroll and felt the room around her not warm, not by the standard of comfort, but held. Stable. The kind of cold that asks something of you but does not take everything. By her estimation, based on what she could feel and on the probe readings she had taken before completing the structure, the interior temperature was somewhere near 48 degrees. She could sleep in 48 degrees. She had her bedroll and her wool blankets and the long underwear she had brought from Pennsylvania. She pulled the blankets to her chin and looked up at the low ceiling of pale mortared earth in the darkness. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the underground room at the mill and about his voice describing it across a kitchen table in the lamplight. She thought about the way he had paid attention to things carefully without hurry, as though everything the world contained was worth understanding if you looked at it long enough. "You were right," she said to the ceiling. She said it quietly, not dramatically, the way you say something to someone who you know is not there but whose absence has not yet become your primary feeling about them. She slept. In the morning, the light came through the south-facing window at a low angle and fell across the floor in a pale rectangle that moved slowly toward the back wall as the hours passed. Clara made a fire in the firebox, a small one, a few sticks of the cedar she had cut, and a knot of pine, and brought a pot of water to boil for coffee. The room, which had held at around 48 degrees through the night, rose to 55 degrees within 40 minutes of the small fire's heat, and then held there as the direct sun added its contribution through the window. She drank her coffee and looked at the light moving across the floor and thought, this will work. It was Edwin Marsh who discovered on that same morning that Clara had survived her first night without any visible sign of heating. He had ridden out to his east pasture before sunrise, intending to move his remaining cattle to the lower meadow before the cold deepened, and on his return he had climbed the ridge from habit. He had been checking the Holt place from the ridge most mornings for 2 weeks without quite admitting to himself that this was what he was doing. From the ridge he could see the front wall clearly in the early light, the small window dark, the low door closed, and where the flue emerged from the hillside above there was nothing. No smoke, no rising column of any kind. Edwin Marsh was not a man given to dramatic reactions. He had raised 4 children and lost one of them, and worked 30 years of Wyoming weather, and maintained through all of it a steadiness that his neighbors admired and his wife occasionally found maddening. But he sat on his horse on the ridge that morning and looked at the absence of smoke from Clara Holt's structure, and something moved through him that was more complicated than concern. He dismounted without deciding to, and tied his horse to a scrubby juniper and walked down the slope toward the front wall of the house. He stood in front of the door for a moment. The basin spread out below and behind him, white and pale in the early light, the mountains to the north still dark against a sky going gray with the promise of another cold day. He raised his hand and knocked. The door opened inward, and Clara Holt stood in the frame. She was wearing a wool shirt and canvas work trousers. No coat. Her hair was tied back at the nape of her neck, neat enough to suggest she had been awake for some time. Her skin had the healthy color of someone who has slept well and woken without distress. Behind her, a thin ribbon of smoke was just beginning to rise from the firebox, not a fire that had burned through the night because the cold demanded it, but a fire started after sunrise for the ordinary purpose of making coffee. Edwin had prepared without knowing he was preparing for the sight of a woman at the edge of freezing. What he saw was a woman who looked as though she had slept without difficulty and woken at her own pace on an ordinary morning. "Wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. Clara looked at him with an expression that held no particular surprise at his presence and no performance of gratitude for his concern. "I'm all right." She stepped back from the doorway, the motion of someone who understands that a conversation held across a threshold in November is colder for both parties than one held inside. Edwin ducked under the doorframe and entered. The room was modest to the point of severity, 12 feet wide by something close to 14 deep, with a ceiling low enough that he could have touched it by raising his arm to the elbow. The sleeping platform occupied the back wall, currently a neatly rolled bedroll sitting on a wooden-faced shelf of packed earth. Wooden boxes along the right wall served as storage. A small table stood in the center of the space with a single stool beside it. On the left wall, the firebox held a fire that was new and small, a careful construction of 3 sticks and a modest knot of pine that was producing heat without drama. What Edwin noticed most was not any of these objects. What he noticed was the air. He had walked half a mile across a November morning that was registering somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees. His fingers were stiff inside his gloves. The tips of his ears ached. In a normal cabin on a morning like this, the warmth near the fire would be fierce, and the cold near the walls would be noticeable. The room divided into zones by the struggle between the fire's output and the outside temperature, trying to reclaim the space through every gap in the timber. This room had no such zones. The warmth was even. Not the concentrated heat of a blazing fire, but a steady, consistent temperature that was present throughout the space along the walls near the floor at the ceiling. He pulled off one glove and held his bare hand against the earth wall to his left, where there was no fire and no window, and which should have been the coldest surface in the room. The wall was not cold. It was slightly below room temperature, noticeably so, but it was dry and stable, holding a quality he had no immediate word for, except to say that it felt occupied as though the material itself had absorbed something and was holding it. He stood like that for long enough that it became a considered thing, not an accidental one. Clara did not interrupt it. She moved to the firebox and set a pot of water on the iron rack above the coals. Edwin took his hand from the wall. "How much firewood did you burn last night?" The question came out before he had decided to ask it, and he heard in his own voice something suspended between skepticism and wonder. Clara settled the pot on the rack and then straightened and turned to face him. "I didn't burn any last night. I lit that this morning. First fire since yesterday afternoon." Edwin looked at the small fire. He looked at the room. He looked back at her. The arithmetic of it was not complicated, but it required him to set aside a framework he had not known he was holding. Until that moment, the framework that said a Wyoming November night at 15 degrees required a fire, required fuel, required the constant vigilance of someone managing a heat source against a cold that was always trying to win. He had accepted this framework so thoroughly over so many winters that it had stopped feeling like a framework and had started feeling like a fact. Clara poured water into a second cup once the pot boiled and held it out to him. Edwin took it and drank the coffee and stood in the middle of the small room and felt the even warmth against his cold, stiffened skin and said nothing for a long time. When he left, he ducked back through the low door frame and stood upright in the November air. The cold settled around him, immediately complete and indifferent. He mounted and turned the horse toward his own property and rode for several minutes before he articulated silently and to no one what had just reorganized itself in his understanding. The room was warm because the walls were warm. The walls were warm because they were earth holding the thermal memory of months that had already passed. The fire was not the source of the heat. The fire was the margin, the small correction applied to a baseline that the earth itself had established and was maintaining. He reached his cabin and went inside. Martha looked up from the stove where she was managing the morning's first serious fire of the day. The room near the stove was warm and the corners were not. Edwin sat down at the table and stared at the surface of it for a long time. Martha set a cup of coffee in front of him. Was she all right? She was fine, completely fine. He wrapped both hands around the cup. She's barely burned any wood. Martha looked at him. She waited. I don't know how to explain it yet, Edwin said. But she's right and we've been wrong, all of us, for a long time. Martha sat down across from him. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin walls with steady insistence, finding the gaps in the chinking and the thin places in the timber where the cold had more purchase than it should, and the stove worked against it with the continuous and costly effort that Edwin had never before had reason to see as costly. He saw it now. He sat with his coffee, and he saw it for what it was, not warmth, but the ongoing expense of warmth, the constant burning of something finite against something that was not. He did not tell anyone else what he had seen, not that day and not the next. He was not a man who reported conclusions before he had finished forming them, and what he had seen in Clara Holt's room was a conclusion he was still turning over, examining from different angles, checking against his own experience, and finding that it held. On the third day after his visit, when the storm had not broken, and his wood supply was dropping at a rate that required him to do the arithmetic and decide he did not like the result, he went out to the north wall of his cabin with a spade. The ground along the north face was not yet frozen at depth. The frost line had descended perhaps 2 feet. Below that, the earth was dense and workable clay. He spent 2 hours moving earth from the slope behind the cabin and packing it against the north wall in a thick berm, working steadily in the cold with his coat on and his hat pulled down. When Martha appeared in the doorway to ask what he was doing, he said, "Trying something." She looked at him for a moment and then went back inside. The berm was not the same as what Clara had built. He understood that. He had simply added an insulating layer to the wall most exposed to the north wind, and the effect which he felt by the following morning was modest. The north wall was less drafty. The cabin held its overnight temperature marginally better. The fire needed slightly less attention in the hours before dawn. But the principle was the same. He was using what the earth offered rather than fighting through it. It was enough to confirm what he had seen in Clara's room. The weeks that followed brought the Basin to the edge of winter's real intention. November moved with increasing seriousness toward December, and the community's preparations took on the slightly feverish quality that comes when people who have lived through hard winters feel a coming one in their bones. Edwin split another half cord and stacked it close to the cabin door. Crane completed a cabin he was building for a new settler on the north end of the Basin and recommended to the man that he keep 8 cords on hand for the first winter 10, if he could manage it. Norman Patton drove to Lander for additional blankets and came back with 2 crates of coal oil for his lamps and an extra sack of dried beans. Clara Holt split no additional wood. The freighter Carson, making another pass on the road south in late November, confirmed what he had seen in early November. The pile outside her door was, if anything, slightly smaller than before. This information produced a new theory in the Basin she was rationing. She had too little wood and she knew it, and she was stretching it as far as possible, which meant that when the deep cold came, she would be in serious trouble. It was almost a mercy, the theory held, that she would figure this out before the worst of winter rather than after. No one voiced this theory directly to Clara. She was present in the community. In a limited way, she came to Lander once every 2 weeks for supplies, spoke politely to those she encountered, conducted her business, and returned to her claim. She was not unfriendly. She was in the way of someone who has organized her life around a task that requires full attention, simply elsewhere, even when she was present. What she was doing during those weeks was working. She had expanded the storage niches along the right wall and packed them with provisions, dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, a crock of lard, dried apples, a bag of coffee. She had sealed a small gap that had opened in the mortar near the base of the front wall. She had cut and stacked her modest woodpile closer to 1/3 of a cord, than the quarter Carson had estimated, selecting the driest and most resinous pieces of cedar and pine, knowing they would burn hot and clean in the small firebox. On the last clear day of November, she sat outside on the slope in the thin afternoon sun and wrote a letter. She had no one to send it to. Her parents were both gone. Thomas's family had never been warm toward her, and her two friends from Pennsylvania had families and lives that had continued in directions that made correspondence increasingly ceremonial. She wrote the letter anyway, addressed it to Thomas, and described in precise and specific terms what she had built and why she believed it would work, and what it had cost her in dollars and weeks of labor, and in the particular currency of being the person that everyone around you is certain is making a mistake. She described the thermocline she had measured on the south slope. She described the angle of the winter sun through the south window. She described the quality of the air inside the room on cold nights that held stable warmth, the earth doing quietly what it had always done, with no need for anyone to tend it or thank it. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and sat for a while longer in the pale sun. The basin was very quiet. The mountains to the north had gone white in the upper reaches. A hawk was working the thermals above the eastern ridge, tilting in the last warmth of the afternoon air. Clara watched it and thought that what she was doing was not so different, using what the environment offered, what was already present and moving, rather than fighting to create conditions that the place had not agreed to provide. She went inside. She made a small fire for supper and let it go out after the meal. The room held its temperature through the night. The first week of December announced itself with a seriousness that even veterans of the Basin's winters regarded with something approaching unease. Old-timers had been saying for 6 weeks that the signs were bad: the early migration of the elk herds, the thickness of the ice on the high lakes by mid-October, the particular quality of the air coming down off the mountains in the evening. On the morning of December 8th, the sky above the Basin was the color of old pewter, and the wind had shifted to come directly from the north, and by noon it was snowing. Not the gentle, tentative snow of early season, but a horizontal driving snow that reduced visibility to 100 yards and filled in the hollows and gathered against the north walls of every structure in the Basin with a speed and weight that said the winter had stopped announcing itself and had simply arrived. By evening of that first day, the temperature had fallen to 14 degrees. By midnight, it was 7. By the morning of December 9th, it was -4. In the Marsh cabin, Edwin had started the fire at 3 in the morning when he woke and found his breath visible in the darkness, despite the fire he had banked at midnight. Martha was awake too, and their youngest daughter, Anna, 6 years old and prone to respiratory trouble in cold weather, had been coughing since the early hours in a way that worried them both. Edwin fed the stove steadily through the dark hours, burning wood faster than he liked to think about. And by dawn, the cabin was warm enough near the stove, but cold enough in the corners, that the water in the pitcher on the washstand had frozen solid. He thought in the intervals between stoking the fire about the quality of air he had felt in Clara Holt's room that November morning. The even warmth, the walls that held temperature without the fire's help. He thought about it, and then he thought about the 8 cords of wood he had stacked outside, and the rate at which this storm was making him burn through them, and he did not let himself finish the thought because there was nothing to be done about it now. The storm did not pause. It held through the 9th and the 10th and into the 11th with the relentless commitment of weather that has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. The temperature at the Lander trading post, which kept a thermometer on the outer wall and recorded readings twice daily, logged -7 on the morning of the 11th, the coldest reading of the season to that point. Families who had thought their firewood stores were adequate began to recalculate. Norman Patton had already burned through half of his largest pile by the end of the second week, a rate he had not planned for, and he began spacing his fires more carefully, letting the cabin cool to uncomfortable levels in the hours before dawn in order to preserve what he had for the most critical heating hours. In the Crane household, Russell Crane burned wood with the confidence of a man who had built his own cabin and trusted it completely. His double-walled construction performed exactly as designed. It held heat well and required substantial fuel to maintain. He was burning through his supply faster than in previous winters because this winter was colder than most. But he had stored 10 cords and he ran the arithmetic regularly and determined he would make it through with a margin. What no one had seen in the 16 days since the storm began was any sign of activity at Clara Holt's claim. The freighter Carson had not made his southern run since the storm closed the road. The neighbors who might have had occasion to pass near her property were staying close to their own fires. The question of her survival, which had been theoretical for months, was now a question with a deadline. At the Lander Trading Post on the morning of December 12th, Norman Patton mentioned to the man behind the counter that he hadn't seen any smoke from the Holt place in a while. The man behind the counter mentioned it to the next 3 customers. By afternoon, the question was circulating through the small cluster of homesteaders who had braved the cold to make supply runs. Had anyone seen Clara Holt? No one had. Edwin Marsh was in his barn when his neighbor's boy came with the news people were wondering about the widow Holt. Edwin finished what he was doing in the barn, which took 20 minutes, and then he went inside and told Martha he was riding to check on the Holt place. Martha looked at him with the expression she wore when he had finally done the thing she had been waiting for him to do, and said nothing. He saddled his horse and rode into the wind. The distance between his property and Clara's was less than a mile by the direct route. In the storm, that mile took him 20 minutes, the horse leaning into the wind with its ears flat, the snow driving horizontally across the open ground, and finding every gap in Edwin's coat collar and glove cuffs with absolute thoroughness. He kept his head down and his bearings by memory and by the shape of the hill ahead. He climbed the slope. He came around the angle of the hill where the front wall became visible. He stopped. From the hillside's small flue pipe rising at its diagonal angle out of the earth, there came a thread of smoke, not thick, not the desperate plume of a fire being driven to its maximum output against a cold that was winning. A thin, quiet, deliberate thread of smoke that moved east in the wind for a foot or two, and then dispersed the smoke of someone who was not burning against fear, but simply burning because they had chosen to. Edwin sat on his horse in the driving snow and looked at that thread of smoke, and something reorganized itself in his chest in a way that was not quite relief and not quite awe, but was the feeling of a man who has been wrong about something and is only now beginning to understand the scale of it. He rode to the door and dismounted and knocked. Clara opened it. She wore a wool shirt, no coat. Her face had the clear-eyed composure of someone in good health on an ordinary day. Behind her, the room was dim and warm, the small firebox holding coals at a low and steady rate, and the air that reached Edwin through the open doorway was not the fierce, concentrated heat of a cabin fire, but something quieter and more persuasive and even warmth, the kind that says, not I am fighting the cold, but simply I am warmer than the cold. Are you all right? Edwin's voice came not quite steady. Perfectly fine. She stepped back from the door. Come in out of the wind. Edwin ducked through the frame and stood inside, and the door closed behind him, and the sound of the storm dropped to a muffled presence, something happening elsewhere. He pulled off his gloves. His fingers found their feeling within seconds, the ordinary return of sensation to hands that had been cold outside and were now in a room of stable and sufficient warmth. He looked at the firebox. The coals were red but low, the remnant of something that had been started hours ago and allowed to settle into its own patient rhythm. He looked at Clara. She was watching him with the level expression he had come to recognize, not unkind, not triumphant, simply present and observant, the expression of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion and is waiting without impatience for others to catch up. How much firewood have you burned? Edwin's words came slowly. Clara met his eyes. Outside, the wind drove itself against the hillside with everything it had, and the hillside absorbed it the way the earth absorbs everything completely, without drama, without being moved. 11 pieces, she said, since the 1st of December. Edwin Marsh stood in the middle of Clara Holt's room for a long time after she said it. 11 pieces. The number sat in the air between them with a particular weight of information that contradicts not just an assumption, but the entire structure of reasoning that produced it. He had burned through nearly 3 cords since the first storm hit. He looked at the firebox with its settled bed of coals, and then at the walls of packed earth around him, and then at Clara, who had not moved from her position near the small table and was watching him with the patient attention of someone who has already done the math and is waiting for the other person to arrive at the same answer. He did not ask her to explain it. He was not certain he was ready to hear the explanation. Instead, he asked the only question that felt manageable in that moment, "Can I put my hand on the wall?" Clara said nothing. She simply waited. Edwin stepped to the north wall, the wall that had no window, no firebox, no south-facing benefit of any kind, The wall that in any timber cabin in the basin was the coldest surface in the room. He pressed his bare palm flat against it and held it there. The earth was cool against his skin, not warm, not comfortable by the standard of a heated room. But it was the cool of a stone in a shaded place in September, not the cold of a frozen surface in December. And the difference between those two things was Edwin understood with sudden and complete clarity the entire argument. The earth remembered summer. Not warmly, not fully, but it had not forgotten it either. The cold had reached the surface months ago and had been working its way inward ever since. And at this depth, at this point in the season, it had not yet arrived. It would eventually. By February or March, the cold would have penetrated further and the baseline would have dropped some degrees. But it would not drop to the temperature of the air outside. The mass of earth surrounding this room was too great and its thermal conductivity too slow and the season too short. The cold would pursue and the earth would yield some ground, but not all of it, and not fast enough to matter. Edwin took his hand from the wall. He turned and looked at Clara. "You're not heating the room from outside temperature." The words came out with the slow deliberateness of a man translating something. "You're heating it from what the ground is already holding." Clara looked at him with an expression that contained something between acknowledgement and relief, the expression of someone who has waited a long time to be understood. "The fire closes a small gap." Her voice came quiet and direct. "The earth closes the rest." He left 20 minutes later, ducking back into the storm, and the cold hit him with the full force it had been holding in reserve. He rode back with his head down and his mind working, not solving a problem because the problem was already solved, but restructuring, placing the thing he had just experienced into relation with everything he thought he knew about winter and shelter and what it cost to survive them. The storm that had arrived on December 8th did not fully release its hold on the basin until the 17th. 9 days of continuous cold and driving snow and temperatures that refused to climb above zero all in the afternoons. When the wind finally turned and the sky broke open on the morning of the 17th into the particular clear blue of a Wyoming winter, after a storm, the basin emerged to assess itself. The damage was visible immediately and everywhere. Firewood stacks that had looked adequate in November had shed a quarter or a third of their volume to 9 days of the hardest cold the basin had seen in a decade. Norman Patton, riding out to check his cattle, stopped at what remained of his primary woodpile and stood looking at it with the expression of a man recalculating everything. He had planned for a hard winter. He had not planned for this particular winter. The gap between those two things was now stacked against the north wall of his barn in the form of what was left, which was not enough. Russell Crane rode to Lander on the day the storm broke, and at the trading post he encountered 3 other homesteaders conducting the same recalculation in public, comparing notes on what they had burned, what remained, what the rest of the winter was likely to demand. The consensus was not comfortable. Crane himself was in better shape than most, having stored 10 cords with the discipline of long experience, but he listened to what the others reported and understood that the basin as a whole was in a tighter position than anyone had expected. It was Norman Patton who, at the trading post counter on that same morning, said aloud what others had been thinking privately. "Nobody's seen smoke from the Holt place in a week, more than a week." Crane looked up from the list he was going over with the man behind the counter. The trading post went quiet. "Marsh rode out," one of the others offered. "Couple days into the storm, said she was fine." "That was 8 days ago," Patton said. This was accurate, and it landed the way accuracy lands when it confirms a concern rather than relieving one. The community had not forgotten what it thought about Clara Holt's Hillside house. The storm had given everyone enough to manage without riding out to check on a neighbor, but now the storm had broken, and the concern that had been deferred came forward. Crane set down his list. He walked outside and stood in the clear, cold air of the post-storm morning and looked south along the road. He had been out to Clara Holt's claim twice. He had declared with the full confidence of his experience that what she was building would either freeze her or suffocate her. 9 days of the worst storm in recent memory had just passed, and no one had seen smoke, and the woman had not appeared in Lander. He went back inside and finished his business and rode home. He thought about the thermometer he kept in his toolbox, a good one accurate to within a degree, purchased in Cheyenne 3 years ago. He thought about it for the rest of that day, And through the following morning, and then on December 19th, he took it out of the toolbox and put it in his coat pocket and rode south. He approached the claim from the road, and when the front wall came into view, he slowed his horse and looked for smoke before anything else. There was a thread of it rising from the small flue, thin and unhurried. Not the smoke of a structure being desperately heated, the smoke of a small fire in a room that did not particularly need the fire but had one anyway. He rode to the front wall and dismounted and knocked. Clara opened the door with the same composure she apparently maintained as a settled response to people arriving at her door in winter. Not surprised, not performing welcome, simply present and at ease in a way that the bitter air outside made startling by contrast. She was wearing the wool shirt, no coat. Crane did not offer apology or preamble. He took the thermometer from his coat pocket and held it up. "I'd like to measure it properly." Clara stepped back from the door. He entered and stood in the room and held the thermometer at chest height in the center of the space, away from the firebox and away from the window. He stood still and watched the mercury stabilize and then read it. 58 degrees. He moved to the north wall where the thermometer would be furthest from the firebox's influence and held it there until it stabilized again. 54 degrees at the north wall. He turned and looked at the firebox, which held a bed of coals that had clearly been banked some hours ago and was producing minimal active heat. He took the thermometer and went back outside and held it in the open air for 3 minutes and read it 19 degrees. He went back inside. 56 degrees, he read it twice. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, stopping at each wall, placing his hand flat, holding it, moving on. The earth wall to the left of the firebox, 52 degrees by his estimate. The earth ceiling above, consistent with the walls, perhaps slightly warmer, where the fire's rising heat had been absorbed over days and weeks. The floor beneath his boots, the tempered cool of deep earth, not the penetrating chill of frozen ground. He stopped in the center of the room and looked at Clara. She was standing near the table, watching him work through his examination without comment, her expression containing neither impatience nor satisfaction, just the clear attention of someone interested in what another person is actually seeing. "The walls are holding the temperature," Crane said, not a question, an observation being spoken aloud to fix it in place. "The walls or the temperature?" Clara's answer came with the precision of someone who has thought about this distinction. "The fire adjusts it slightly, the earth provides it." Crane looked at the thermometer in his hand, 56 degrees with a nearly cold firebox. The basin outside was at 19. He was a man who built things for a living, and he understood in the specific and practical way of someone who works with materials what this room was doing. It was not a room heated by a fire. It was a room that existed within a thermal envelope, surrounded on 5 sides by earth, that maintained its own temperature, independent of the air above the surface, with the 6th side, the south-facing front wall, designed to admit solar gain in winter and manage it carefully. The narrow flue, the small firebox, the low ceiling, the south window angled to capture the winter sun, the sod roof that insulated the earth above. Each element had a function, and the functions worked together. He had walked past this structure twice and declared it inadequate and ridden away, and it had been working the entire time quietly, completely, without drama or strain, exactly as its builder had understood it would. He had called it a grave. He stood in the middle of it in December with the storm-scoured basin at 19 degrees outside and the temperature inside at 56 without a significant fire burning, and he understood with the thoroughness of a craftsman that he had been wrong in the specific and instructive way that craftsmen are wrong when they mistake their familiarity with one method for understanding of all methods. "I called this place a grave." His voice came quiet, the words chosen and set down deliberately, one at a time, the way you say something that costs you something to say. "I was wrong." Clara looked at him. She did not nod, did not speak, did not move her expression in the direction of vindication. She simply received it the way the earth receives heat in summer, without fanfare, storing it for later. Crane put the thermometer back in his coat pocket. He looked around the room once more. The design details he had dismissed as ignorance the first time he saw them, resolved now into a different thing entirely. Not ignorance, but knowledge of a kind he had not encountered before, applied with the patience and precision of someone who had done the calculation and trusted it. In the spring, his words came measured, "I'd like to talk with you about how you position the window." Clara said, "I'll be here." He left. The ride back to his property took him past 3 other homesteaders' cabins, and at each one he noted the woodpile and the smoke from the chimney, and thought about the volume of fuel those fires were consuming every hour to maintain a temperature inside those structures that was almost certainly lower than what he had just measured in a room with nearly no fire burning. The news of Crane's visit traveled the basin faster than the news of Edwin's had. He mentioned it to the man at the hardware counter when he went back for the hinges he had forgotten. The man at the hardware counter mentioned it to the next 4 people who came in. By the following day, the basin knew that Russell Crane, who had built 41 cabins and declared Clara Holt's structure a grave in November, had ridden out with a thermometer and come back saying something had changed in his understanding. Norman Patton decided to go himself. He arrived on a morning when the temperature had climbed back to the mid-20s following the storm's passage. He tied his horse at the fence post below the slope and climbed to the front wall and knocked. He was carrying his own thermometer, a less precise household model that he used to monitor his root cellar, and he had it in his coat pocket with a purpose that was partly scientific and partly something he would not have named as the defensiveness, but that was close to it. He was a man who had offered Clara Holt the use of his storage barn in September. He had done it from genuine goodwill, but goodwill extended from a position of assumed superiority, from the posture of someone who has succeeded where another is expected to fail, was a particular kind of kindness, and Norman Patton was honest enough in the private accounting of himself to know that his offer had contained that posture. He had assumed she would fail. He had been ready with a soft landing, and now he was standing outside her door with a thermometer in his pocket and the evidence of a storm she had survived better than he had, and the recalibration required of him was not only about construction methods. Clara opened the door and he came inside, and she allowed him to take his measurement without offering to help or explain. He held the thermometer in the center of the room for 4 minutes and read at 53 degrees. Outside, his thermometer had read 24 degrees. The difference was 29 degrees, maintained by earth and design and almost no active heating. He stood with the thermometer in his hand and looked at the number, and then looked around the room and then put the thermometer back in his pocket. "How much does it drop at night when you don't use the fire?" "The lowest I've measured is 44 degrees, Clara said, "in the middle of the cold stretch last week. I lit a small fire in the morning and it came back to 50 within the hour." Patton stood with his hands in his pockets. He thought about his own cabin on the worst nights of the storm, the fire going out before dawn, the temperature inside dropping to 32, or below, waking his wife and children, the cold finding the thin places in the walls and the gaps under the door, and pressing through them with the unhurried patience of something that has all night and all winter and all the time in the world. He thought about the offer he had made in September, delivered with the gentle certainty of someone who knew better. He did not apologize. He was not sure he had the words for what an apology would have to contain, which was not just the specific misjudgment, but the assumption beneath it. Instead, he stood in the room and looked at the floor, and then at the walls, and then at the small window, where the winter light came through at its low southern angle and fell in a pale rectangle across the packed earth floor. "My root cellar stays above freezing all winter," he said, not to Clara specifically, thinking aloud in the presence of someone who would understand what he was arriving at. "I never thought about why." Clara waited. "It's the same thing," Patton said. "The earth, it's the same thing." "Yes," Clara said, "it is." He left without saying what he planned to do. But 3 days later, Edwin Marsh, riding the ridge above his east pasture, in what had become a habit he no longer tried to justify to himself, saw Norman Patton on the slope behind his farmhouse with a spade. Patton was not splitting firewood. He was moving earth. He was carrying it from the hillside at the back of his property and placing it against the north and east walls of his main cabin in quantities that suggested not casual experiment, but serious intention. Edwin watched for a while, then he rode on. The basin was recalibrating. Not uniformly, not loudly, not with any central declaration, just the way understanding actually moves through a community of practical people, which is quietly and through action, person by person, each one arriving at the new position through their own path of evidence and conclusion. It was not a revolution. It was more like a river shifting its course by a few degrees The change was real and cumulative, and eventually it would matter enormously, but at any given moment, it looked like just a man moving dirt behind his house. In the third week of December, a cold front arrived that the old-timers had not predicted because it came from the west off the high plateau carrying a dry cold that was different from the wet cold of the earlier storm. It dropped the temperature at the Lander trading post to -11 on its worst morning, the coldest reading anyone could remember in December. The basin absorbed it with the diminished reserves of a community that had already been tested once and had not fully recovered. A family named Werner on the north end of the basin burned through their remaining wood in 4 days and began burning furniture. A chair on the first day, a chest of drawers on the second, the legs of a spare bed on the third. Crane heard about the Werners on a Tuesday and rode to their claim with a cord of his own wood stacked in his wagon, which he unloaded and stacked against their cabin wall without being asked and without presenting it as a gift that required acknowledgement. He was a practical man, and the Werners were his neighbors, and they needed wood. He rode home and calculated what he had left and determined he had enough. Barely enough, but enough. At the trading post, the price of split firewood had increased by 40% since October. Families who had budgeted carefully for the season were now facing a mathematics that did not resolve. Conversations at the trading post, which had been quietly comparing notes on Clara Holt's situation for weeks, began to take a different character. The conversations were no longer about whether she was surviving. She had survived the worst storm of the decade so warm quietly and with minimal fuel in a structure that everyone had predicted would kill her. The conversations now were about what that meant, about what it suggested for the way the basin had been doing things, and whether the way the basin had been doing things was in some fundamental sense wrong. This was a harder conversation than the first one because it was not about Clara, it was about them. It was Norman Patton who said it most directly on a Thursday morning at the trading post counter to a group of 4 men who had been circling the subject for 20 minutes. "We've been fighting winter the wrong way." His words came without drama, a simple observation from a man who had done his own arithmetic. "Every cord we burn is us losing the fight a little slower." "She's not fighting it at all." The men at the counter were quiet for a moment. Outside, the cold front pressed against the building with its dry western insistence, and the stovepipe on the trading post stove ticked and creaked with the effort of heating a poorly insulated space in negative temperatures. It was, in its way, an illustration of the point. One of the men, a homesteader named Garrett, who had arrived in the basin 2 years before Clara, said, "It's one structure, one woman who got lucky with the ground conditions on that particular slope." Patton looked at him. "Russell Crane measured 56 degrees in there with a cold firebox, in the worst storm we've had in 10 years. He let this sit. That's not luck. That's building." Garrett had no immediate answer to this. The stovepipe ticked. The cold pressed in through the gaps around the door. The conversation did not resolve into consensus that morning. These things rarely do. But something shifted in the weight of opinion, the way the center of balance in a room shifts, when enough people quietly move to one side, not dramatically, not with announcement, just with the slow redistribution of where people actually stand. On a Friday afternoon in late December, with the cold front still holding its grip and the light going early and the basin settling into the particular blue-gray twilight of a Wyoming December, Clara Holt sat at her small table and wrote in the margin of Thomas's notebook. She had filled the margins of several pages over the course of the fall and early winter. Not with new calculations or diagrams, but with observations, what the temperature had been on a given morning, how long the fire had lasted, how the room felt on the third day of a cold front versus the first. She was building a record not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was what Thomas would have done. Observation first, always observation first, before conclusion, before recommendation, before the temptation to believe that what you understood was the same as what was true. She noted that the room's baseline temperature had dropped by 3 degrees over the course of December, from 48 degrees at the start of the month to 45 at present, and that this drop was consistent with her expectation that the cold would penetrate incrementally deeper into the earth as the season progressed. She noted that the drop had been slower than she had feared in her most uncertain moments in October, when she had run the numbers and believed them, but had not yet had winter itself confirm they were right. She noted that she had used, as of this date, less than 1/4 of her available firewood. She did not write about the visitors, not about Edwin's stunned silence in front of her north wall, not about Crane's careful walk around the room's perimeter with his thermometer, not about Patton's long look at his own root cellar, arrived at through the floor of her room. These were their stories to carry, not hers to record. What she recorded was the room and what the room was doing, because the room was the argument, and the argument needed no advocate except the evidence it was already making. Outside, the wind moved across the basin with the particular sound it made. At negative temperatures, a sound that was less a howl than a compression, a sustained pressure against every surface that faced it. Inside, the room held. The earth held. The temperature at 10 o'clock on a Friday night in late December, with the cold front in its 5th day, and the thermometer outside reading -9 was 47 degrees, and the firebox was cold, and had been cold since morning. Clara set down her pencil and looked at Thomas's original handwriting, filling the pages, the careful observations of a man who had understood that the world worked according to principles that patience could discover. She thought about the basin outside, the families, burning furniture, the woodpiles diminishing, the conversations at the trading post shifting towards something that had not yet been named. She thought about Edwin Marsh adding earth to his north wall in the early morning, cold, without explanation, the practical action of a man who has learned something and is applying it. She did not think of it as winning. She had not built this room to win anything. She had built it to survive, and she was surviving, and the way she was surviving was beginning to teach the basin something it needed to know, and that was all she had intended. She blew out the candle and lay down on the sleeping platform and pulled the blankets over her shoulders. The earth held its temperature through the night, as it had held it through every night since November, as it would continue to hold it through January and February, not because she had asked it to, not because she had fought for it, but because the earth's thermal memory is long, and its patience is complete, and it yields its warmth slowly across the whole arc of a season to anyone who understands how to work with it rather than against it. She slept without a fire in the basin's coldest December in a generation, and the room was 46 degrees when she woke, and she lit a small fire and made coffee and watched the winter light come through the south window at its low and specific angle and fall across the floor in a pale moving square, and she thought, one more month. February, then the back of winter begins to break. She had wood enough for 2 months more easily. She would make it without question. What she did not yet know, could not know from inside the room, was that 3 miles north Norman Patton had made his decision. He had spent December watching his wood supply and watching the temperature and doing the arithmetic over and over until the arithmetic stopped being something he could argue with. On the last day of December, he had walked the slope behind his house with stakes and string and a measuring tape marking out a south-facing cut into the hillside. He had not told his wife yet. He was planning to tell her in the morning. He was going to build a winter room. He was going to build it the way Clara Holt had built hers, into the earth below the frost line, with the ground's own thermal mass doing the work that fire had always done before. He was going to build it because the mathematics of December had been unambiguous, and because he had stood in that room with his household thermometer reading 53 degrees, while his own cabin barely held 38 on its worst nights. And because there are some arguments that a practical man cannot continue to make against the evidence once the evidence has had the opportunity to speak at its full volume. He was also going to tell Crane, not to suggest that Crane should build one too. Crane would arrive at his own conclusions in his own time, but because Crane was the most skilled builder in the basin, and because if Norman was going to excavate into a hillside, he would rather do it with better technique than worse. He suspected Crane would have thoughts. He suspected, given the look on Crane's face when he had returned from his thermometer visit, to Clara Holt's claim that those thoughts were already forming. The year turned. The basin moved into January with its firewood depleted and its understanding quietly restructuring, and Clara Holt's small flue pipe producing its steady, patient thread of smoke above the south-facing hillside, a signal that had stopped being surprising and was beginning, in the way that all true things eventually do, to look inevitable. January and Wind River Basin arrived without ceremony and without mercy. The cold front that had settled over the basin in late December did not lift with the turning of the year. It simply continued, indifferent to the calendar, pressing its dry western weight against every surface that faced it. The cottonwoods along the creek stood stripped in gray, their branches coated in a thin rime that caught the low winter light and held it without warmth. The open ground between properties had the particular texture of deep frozen earth, not soft with snow, but hard and compact, the surface crusted to a depth that horses' hooves struck with a sound like iron on stone. Norman Patton told his wife about the winter room on the second morning of January. He had spent New Year's Eve sitting at his kitchen table with his measurements and his arithmetic while Margaret slept, and by midnight he had the plan drawn on paper in enough detail that it was no longer a possibility he was considering, but a decision he had made. He told her over breakfast, laying the drawing on the table beside her coffee cup and explaining what he intended to build and why, walking her through the numbers. From December, the wood burned. The temperature maintained the comparison he had made standing in Clara Holt's room with his household thermometer reading 53 degrees, while his own cabin was struggling to hold 38 on its worst nights. Margaret Patton was a practical woman who had homesteaded Wyoming for 9 years and had arrived at a general philosophy about her husband's decisions, which was that they were usually sound but often slow. She looked at the drawing for a long time. She asked 2 questions: how long would it take to build, and would it be finished before next November? Norman said he thought 6 weeks if he worked steadily and if Crane would consult. Margaret said, then you should ask Crane today. Crane agreed to consult without being asked twice. He arrived at the Patton property on the 4th of January with his own set of questions about the slope angle of the hillside Norman had chosen, about the composition of the soil, at depth about the orientation relative to the winter sun. He had brought his thermometer again, and he spent an hour probing the hillside with an iron rod and pressing his hand into the soil at various depths, and then he stood back and looked at the site with the evaluating eye of a man who has built 41 structures and is preparing to build his first one differently. The consultation lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Crane had suggested 6 modifications to Norman's original plan, adjustments to the depth of excavation, to the angle of the flue, to the placement of the south-facing window. All of them were refinements of principles Clara had demonstrated, translated into the language of a carpenter who had now had 3 weeks to think about what he had measured in her room. Norman accepted the modifications without argument. They broke ground on the 7th. What Crane did not mention during those 3 hours, or in the days of digging that followed, was that he had already begun his own drawings. Not for a client, for himself. He had started them on the day after his thermometer visit to Clara's claim, working at his drafting table in the evenings by lamplight and applying everything he knew about construction to the problem of building a structure that worked with the Earth's thermal properties rather than against the sky's cold ones. The drawings were detailed in the way that Crane's work always was dimensioned, annotated with notes in his tight handwriting about material choices and sequencing. He had not told anyone about them. He was not ready to build yet, and he was not a man who announced intentions before he was ready to act on them. But the drawings existed, and each evening he returned to them and refined something, and the refinements were getting smaller, which meant he was getting close. Clara knew none of this in January. She knew that Patton had been on the slope near his farmhouse with stakes and string on the last day of December. She had seen him from her doorway in the late afternoon light, moving with the deliberate purpose of someone making decisions rather than taking a walk. She had not gone to speak with him. If he wanted to talk, he would come down. And if he had decided to build, her talking would add nothing to what the building itself would teach him. She had learned this much about the Basin in the months since she arrived: its people were not resistant to evidence. They were resistant to being told. These were different things, and the distinction mattered. She spent January working on the interior of her own structure in the ways that a first winter always reveals necessary. The storage niches along the right wall had proven slightly too shallow for the crocks and tins she was wintering with, and she spent 2 days deepening them with a hand chisel, working carefully to avoid disturbing the packed earth above. The mortar at the base of the front wall had cracked in one place where the freeze-thaw cycle at the surface was slightly more active than she had accounted for, a crack less than half an inch wide and perhaps 8 inches long, but worth addressing before it widened. She mixed a fresh batch of clay mortar and worked it into the crack in layers, allowing each layer to begin curing before applying the next. She also built a second small shelf on the left wall opposite the firebox for the purpose of holding a lamp at the correct height for reading in the evenings. This was not a structural modification. It was the modification of someone who planned to stay, who was thinking about the quality of winter evenings in this room over the long term rather than the short. Clara noticed as she shaped the shelf from packed clay and faced it with a board she cut from one of her remaining planks that this was the first improvement she had made to the room that was not about survival. The room was past the point of needing to prove itself. Now it needed to become the thing it was going to be for however many winters she planned to live in it. She planned to live in it for many winters. She had not articulated this to anyone, partly because no one had asked, and partly because the articulation felt unnecessary. The room existed and she was in it, and that was the statement, complete and self-evident. But it was true. She was not in Wyoming Territory to survive one winter and report back on the experience. She was here because this was where she had decided to build a life, and the life she was building had a structure beneath it now, literally and otherwise, and she intended to continue building it. Edwin Marsh came by in the second week of January, not during a storm this time, but on a clear, cold afternoon when the temperature was a reasonable 15 degrees above zero, and the basin was quiet in the way it had got between weather systems, an interval of stillness that felt almost like an apology for what had come before. He knocked and Clara opened the door, and he asked if he could come in and talk for a while, rather than just stand and measure things. She said yes and made coffee, and they sat at the small table. He explained, been adding earth to his north and west walls in stages throughout January, working on the mornings when the temperature allowed it. He had also covered the top of his root cellar with an additional 2 feet of sod, and here he paused, looking into his coffee cup as though checking that the words were still in order before he said them. The root cellar had always maintained above freezing temperatures, which he had attributed to the canning jars and the stored vegetables generating some modest heat. He understood now that the vegetables had nothing to do with it. The earth did. The earth had always done it, and he had never thought carefully about why. Clara listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she had learned in 2 years of being a widow who had decided things without anyone's approval, that the moment when someone arrives at understanding is not the moment to add information. It is the moment to be quiet and let the understanding settle into its full shape. I should have looked at your structure more carefully in September. Edwin's voice came measured and without excess. Instead of deciding what it was before I looked. Clara held her coffee cup with both hands. You drove a stake in the fence line and watched from the ridge. That's looking. That's looking from a safe distance, he answered. There's a difference. She did not tell him there wasn't. She thought there was. He left an hour later, and what he carried out with him was not just the conversation, but something that had shifted slightly in the room's atmosphere during it, a quality of mutual acknowledgement that had not existed between them before December. Not friendship precisely, not yet something more foundational than that, the recognition of two people who had both been right about something important and had arrived at that truth by different roads and could now stand on the same ground without either of them pretending the road had been easy. February came in with a long, cold stretch that the old-timers recognized as the season's final effort, the last sustained assault before the arc began to bend toward spring. The temperature did not drop as dramatically as December's worst days, but it held its ground with a persistence that was, in its way, more wearing than extreme cold. 2 weeks of mornings at within 10 and 12 degrees afternoons that climbed to the mid-20s at best and often did not bother nights that settled back to single digits and stayed there until the next pale dawn. The kind of cold that does not startle but accumulates, wearing down the reserves of both firewood and patience with equal efficiency. Norman Patton's winter room was not yet complete when February arrived. The excavation had gone well and the structural elements were in place, but the interior work was slower than he had estimated, partly because the cold made the clay mortar reluctant to cure properly, and partly because Crane had recommended a more careful approach to the south window framing than Norman had originally planned. Crane came out twice a week to check the work and consult on the details, and on one of these visits, he brought a question that had been forming in his thinking for several weeks. He was standing outside the partly finished winter room, looking at the angle of the south wall's window opening, when he asked Clara she had come down from her own place having seen Crane's horse at the Patton fence line, whether she had done any formal calculation for the window's angle, or whether she had arrived at it through observation. Clara looked at the window framing that Norman and Crane had installed, which matched the angle of her own within a few degrees. Observation, she said. I watched where the winter sun fell at noon on the days around the solstice and measured the angle with a length of string in a plumb bob. Then I worked backward to find the window angle that would let that light reach the back wall. Crane was quiet for the moment. He looked at the window framing, then at the angle of the winter sun currently at its low southern arc in the early February sky. He was doing the geometry in his head, not complicated geometry, but the kind that requires a clear spatial understanding of how light moves through a fixed opening as the sun's altitude changes across the seasons. He had not been taught this in any formal way. He had over 41 cabins, developed an intuitive sense of how structures related to the sun, mostly in terms of avoiding west-facing windows that produced afternoon glare in summer. He had not thought carefully about winter sun as a resource rather than an inconvenience to be managed. The summer sun wouldn't come through that angle, he said. Not a question, confirming. It's too high in summer, Clara said. The window captures winter and misses summer, that's the point. Crane looked at the angle for another long moment. He took out his notebook, a new one, not the same notebook he had used for the measurements on his first visit, and wrote something in it with the stub of a pencil. Clara did not ask what he was writing. She could see from the way he wrote it that it was a number he needed to preserve. It was the angle. He was writing down the angle so he could use it in his own drawings. She said nothing about the drawings. She did not know about them. But she understood from the notebook and the pencil and the way Crane's expression had shifted from the evaluating look of a consultant to the absorbed concentration of a craftsman solving his own problem, that Russell Crane was no longer merely helping Norman Patton build a winter room. He was preparing to build something himself. She let this understanding sit quietly where she found it and did not disturb it. Arthur Selby arrived in Wind River Basin on a morning in the third week of February. He was a territorial surveyor based in Cheyenne, responsible for documenting homestead conditions across a large section of Wyoming Territory. And he came to the Basin not because he had heard about Clara Holt specifically, but because the Basin's land agent had flagged it in a quarterly report as an anomaly. The abandonment rate for homestead claims in the Wind River Basin had dropped significantly in the previous year, to a level substantially below the territorial average for comparable land. Claims in basins like this one high altitude, minimal timber, severe winters typically failed at a rate of 40% or more in the first 3 years. The basin's current rate of active maintained claims suggested something was different here, and Selby's job was to find out what. He spent his first 2 days interviewing homesteaders. He went to the trading post and to the cabins of the larger landholders, and he asked questions with the methodical patience of a man who has spent years assembling pictures from fragments. The fragments he collected from 6 different people over 2 days all pointed in the same direction: the south-facing hillside on the Holt claim, and the woman who had built into it rather than above it. He rode to Clara's property on the 3rd day of his visit, arriving in the mid-morning, when the sun was at its clearest angle, and the basin was stretched out below the hill in its full winter scale. He noticed before he reached the front wall that the south-facing window caught the light in a way that cabin windows did not. Not the flat reception of a vertical pane, but the angled admission of something positioned to intercept rather than merely receive. He noted this in his survey book before he knocked. Clara opened the door. She took in the survey book and the leather satchel and the quality of his coat, which was the coat of someone who traveled on official business rather than between fields, and she made the correct identification without being told. She stepped back from the door. Selby entered and stood in the room and was quiet for 30 seconds, in the way of someone who is observing rather than acclimating. He looked at the ceiling, at the walls, at the firebox, at the window angle, at the floor. He was not a builder, he was a surveyor, and his training was in measurement and documentation. But he was a man who understood structures in the way that someone who has inspected hundreds of them develops understanding through comparison and pattern, and the specific attention that comes from professional obligation. He took his own thermometer from the satchel without asking permission, held it in the center of the room, waited, read it, and wrote the number in his book. He noted the time, the outdoor temperature he had read at the trading post that morning, the state of the firebox. He then asked Clara a series of questions with the efficient directness of someone accustomed to conducting interviews. When did she begin building? What were the primary materials? What had the total cost been? How had she arrived at the structural design? And what was her background in engineering or construction? Clara answered each question in order. When she reached the last one, she paused for a moment and then said, "My husband was a millwright. He understood how heat moves through materials. He explained it to me over the years we were married, not as instruction but as conversation. He thought carefully about things, and I listened carefully." That's the background. Selby wrote for a moment. He looked up at her. "Where did he study?" "He didn't," Clara said. "He observed. He read when he could find books worth reading. Mostly he paid attention to what the materials were already doing and worked with that." Selby held his pencil above the page for a moment and then wrote something. He asked several more questions about the flue diameter and the reasoning behind it, about the sod roof's thickness and how she had compacted it, about the drainage channels she had cut above the front wall to direct snowmelt away from the foundation. He asked these questions with an interest that was not the polite interest of someone collecting data, but the engaged interest of someone who is finding what he is looking at more complex and more considered than he anticipated. When he had finished the questions, he sat back on the stool Clara had offered him and looked around the room with the expression of a man consolidating what he has learned. Outside, February's persistent cold pressed against the hillside. Inside, the room held its temperature with the same steady indifference to weather that it had maintained since November. Not fighting, not straining, simply existing at a thermal level that the earth beneath and around it had agreed to maintain. "I came here looking for an explanation of why this basin's Homestead numbers are better than comparable basins," Selby said. His voice had shifted from the efficient register of official inquiry to something more considered. "I expected to find a water source or a sheltered microclimate or some advantage in the soil for crops. Something that explained why people weren't leaving." He paused. "I wasn't expecting this." Clara waited. "This isn't a curiosity," Selby continued. "What you've built here is a solution to one of the primary reasons homesteaders abandon claims in high-altitude territories. The fuel cost, the thermal vulnerability of timber construction at these altitudes. You've addressed both of them in the same structure." He looked at his survey book. "For $15 and 3 weeks of labor." Clara said, "It took what the place offered. The hillside was here. The clay was here. The sun angles the same every year. I used what was already present." Selby looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to say something. He decided to. "Mrs. Holt, I'm going to include a detailed account of this structure in my territorial survey report. The report goes to the land office in Cheyenne, and it's available to settlement agencies and to Congress. I want you to understand that what I document here may be read by people who make decisions about how settlement in Wyoming Territory is approached." He held her gaze. "I'll attribute it correctly. Your name will be in the document." Clara thought about this. She had not built the room to be documented. She had not thought in the months of digging and mortaring and calculating sun angles with a plumb bob and a length of string about Cheyenne, or about Congress, or about settlement policy. She had thought about February. She had thought about getting through the winter alive and intact and with enough wood left that she did not have to face the spring depleted and behind. She had thought about Thomas's voice explaining the underground room at the mill, the way the cool air in the lower level maintained itself independent of the weather above. "Write what you observed," she said. "That's all any of it is." Selby spent another hour at the property walking the exterior with his measuring tape and his survey book, noting the drainage channels in the south window angle and the sod roof thickness in the flue exit point. He was thorough in the way that official documentation requires thoroughness, and Clara let him work without accompaniment, returning inside to the tasks of the afternoon, while he moved around the exterior with his tape and his pencil. When he left, he rode to the trading post and spent another hour there asking the trading post owner about the Holt structure and what the community's response to it had been. The owner, who had been at the center of the basin's information flow since September, gave Selby a thorough answer. Selby wrote for most of it and then rode back to Lander for the night. What he had written in his survey book included the observation that the structure represented an adaptation to high-altitude winter conditions of unusual ingenuity, achieved without formal training and at minimal cost, and that its principles appeared to be propagating through the basin's homesteading community with measurable effect on settlement retention. He had written this before he rode to the trading post. The conversation at the trading post confirmed it was an understatement. The winter room on Norman Patton's property was completed on the 14th of February. Crane drove the last of the finish mortar into the window frame on a Tuesday afternoon when the temperature was 11 degrees and the light was already going early, and Norman and Margaret came out and stood in the finish room while Crane packed his tools, and they felt the space close around them, the low ceiling, the earth walls, the specific stillness of a room that is inside the hill rather than on top of it. Margaret held out her hand and pressed it to the north wall and held it there. She looked at her husband. She had lived through 9 Wyoming winters. She knew what cold felt like through a wall, the seeping chill that comes through timber. Even in a well-built cabin, the subtle claim the cold makes on the air of a room through every surface that touches the outside. What she felt under her palm was not that. What she felt was the earth's tempered cool, the temperature of something that had not been fully reached by the season's worst efforts. "It feels like September," she said. Not what she had expected to say, but accurate. Crane left them standing in their new room and drove his wagon home. He did not stay for supper, though Margaret offered. He wanted to get back to his drafting table. The drawings he had been refining through January and February were close to final now. The modifications he had worked out during the Patton excavation incorporated the window angle noted from the February consultation with Clara, committed to paper in its precise degree, the flue dimensions calculated on the basis of 3 visits to Clara's Firebox, and 1 careful afternoon with a pencil and a reference book on draft physics that he had ordered from a bookseller in Denver months earlier. He sat at the drafting table that evening and looked at the drawings for a long time. He had been building cabins for 20 years. He understood timber in its specific and complete way, how it moved with moisture, how it settled with age, how its thermal properties compared with stone and with clay, and with the air itself, which was, he now understood clearly, the worst insulator a builder could choose, and the one that timber framing by its nature was full of. Every stud cavity, every gap in the chinking, every space between the inner wall and the outer surface that was not dense material was air, and air was the enemy of warmth. And he had been building structures full of it for 2 decades and calling them good cabins. They were good cabins. By the standard of what everyone in the basin was building, they were among the best. But the standard was wrong, and he had spent 9 weeks understanding why, and the understanding had reorganized his drafting table into something different from what it had been in October. He began drawing the next morning. Not a client's cabin, his own structure, a winter room added to the north end of his existing workshop, excavated into the hillside behind it, designed according to the principles he had assembled from 9 weeks of observation and calculation. He had the skills to build it himself, working on the days between client commissions. He estimated 3 months of part-time work, which meant he could have it complete before next November. He told no one about it for 2 more weeks. When he finally mentioned it at the trading post in passing to Edwin Marsh, who had stopped in for supplies and was standing at the counter with his coat still on, he said it the way practical men say things they have decided without preamble and without request for opinion. "I'm adding an earth-sheltered room to my workshop this spring, based on the Holt design." Edwin looked at him. Crane had said in November that Clara Holt's structure was a grave. He had said it in this trading post to several people with the confidence of a man whose expertise was not in question. He was now standing in the same trading post, saying he was building one himself. Edwin did not point this out. He said, "The window angle is the piece that took me longest to understand. If you want to talk it through, I've been thinking about it." Crane said, "Come by Thursday." This was how the basin worked. Not through declarations or ceremonies or formal changes of position. Through Thursday morning conversations at a drafting table between 2 men who had both been wrong about something and were both in their different ways fixing it. Through Norman Patton's winter room, sitting complete and warm in the hillside behind his farmhouse. Through Edwin Marsh's north wall, bermed 3 feet deep now after a month of gradual addition, reducing his cabin's heat loss enough that his February wood consumption was measurably lower than January's, despite February's cold being comparable. Through a territorial surveyor's report traveling to Cheyenne with Clara Holt's name in it, and a description of what she had built and what it cost and what it had demonstrated. March arrived with the first suggestion of change, not warmth, nothing as direct as that, but a shift in the quality of the cold, a slight softening of the sky's color from the pewter gray of deep winter to something fractionally more blue. The temperature did not climb significantly, but the angle of the light changed as it always did at this point in the season, and the basin's inhabitants registered this change in the specific way of people who have been paying close attention to the light for months. It felt like information. It felt like the season making an early announcement. In Clara's room, the change was measurable rather than just perceptible. The south window's admission of direct light had been shifting gradually since the solstice, the sun's arc climbing by small increments each day, changing the angle at which light entered the room. The light that had been falling on the back wall in deep winter was now reaching only to the midpoint of the floor. By April, it would clear the windowsill entirely. This was Clara had calculated the correct behavior, the structure responding to the season's shift in a way she had designed and had now watched actually occur. Theory met by evidence, calculation confirmed by the world's actual behavior. She noted it in Thomas's notebook and felt something that was not pride. Exactly pride seemed too small a word, but was in the neighborhood of the feeling you have when someone you trusted has been proved right, even when the someone is yourself. The cold eased through March in stages, each stage grudging the winter releasing its grip the way things release what they have held for months slowly with occasional reversals, not in a straight line, but in the general direction of something different. By the third week of March, the daytime temperature was regularly above freezing, and the creek ice began to develop the dark water-soaked appearance of ice that is thinking about breaking. The cottonwoods along the creek were still bare, but the color of their branches had shifted from the silver gray of winter to the faintly reddish-brown of wood that is approaching the season when it will be required to do something again. Clara began spending more time outside. This was practical. There were fences to check soil to turn in the kitchen garden plot she had staked out on the south slope near the front wall, the drainage channels above the structure to clear of the debris that had accumulated over winter. But it was also something less practical and more necessary after months inside the room, after the specific intimacy of a winter spent inside 12 by 14 feet of earth. Enclosed space, the expansion of the world outward, to include the basin and the sky above it, and the mountains still white to the north, felt essential in a way that was hard to articulate. The room had kept her alive and well. The spring was reminding her what she was alive and well for. Crane came on a Thursday in late March, not to consult about Patton's room, which was complete, but to look at Clara's structure again, with eyes that had spent 3 months becoming more educated. He brought the detailed drawings he had made for his own winter room, and he spread them on Clara's small table, and she looked at them without speaking for several minutes, studying the dimensions and the annotations in the window angle he had marked in a small circle at the top right of the main elevation drawing. She pointed to the flue. His drawing showed a diameter slightly larger than hers, 5 inches to her 4. Why larger, she asked. More flexible for different fuel types, Crane said. Oak or hickory instead of cedar. The denser wood needs more draw. Clara considered this. If the draw is stronger, you lose more warm air. Marginally, Crane said. I've calculated it. The difference in heat retention is less than the difference in fuel flexibility. Clara looked at the number he had written beside the flue dimension. She could not evaluate his calculation without doing it herself, but the number was specific enough that she could tell it was a real calculation and not an estimate. What did you use for the thermal conductivity of the clay mortar? She asked. Crane looked at her. This was not the question he had expected. It was the question of someone who had done the same calculation and knew what went into it. He told her the value he had used and where he had found it, the reference book from Denver, and she nodded and said the value she had used from her own research was within 5% of his. They looked at each other across the table with the expression of two people who have discovered through different paths, taken independently, that they arrived at the same place. You could go to 4.5, Clara said. The 1/2 inch won't limit your fuel options, but it will reduce the draw loss. Crane looked at his drawing. He picked up his pencil and changed the number. He did this without any visible difficulty, a craftsman revising a drawing because the revision improves it, which is what drawings are for. Clara watched him make the change and thought, this is what it looks like when a person learns without needing the learning to be a defeat. The report Arthur Selby filed with the Cheyenne Land Office in late March was 42 pages long and covered 11 homestead properties across 3 basins in Wyoming Territory. Clara Holt's claim occupied 6 of those pages, more space than any other single property in the report. The 6 pages included a measured drawing of the structure's cross-section, a table comparing its documented winter fuel consumption to the estimated consumption of timber frame cabins of equivalent interior volume, a description of the thermal principles underlying its design, and a summary of the structure's apparent influence on neighboring homestead practices. Clara never read it. She was not in Cheyenne and had no mechanism for reviewing territorial survey reports. What she received 6 weeks after Selby's visit was a brief letter from the land office in Cheyenne confirming that her homestead claim was in good standing and that her land improvements had been noted as exceptional. The letter was signed by an administrator she had never heard of and contained nothing that required a response. She read it once, noted what it said, and put it in the drawer where she kept Thomas's notebook. The drawer was the closest thing she had to an archive. It contained the notebook, the letter from the land office, a careful list of her expenses since arriving in Wyoming, every dollar accounted for, beginning with the $15.40 the structure had cost, and the letter she had written to Thomas on the last clear day of November, and never sent the one that described everything she had built and why she believed it would work. She had not reread that letter since she wrote it. She did not need to. She had written it when she was still believing in advance of proof, and the proof had come, and the letter belonged to the time before the proof, when believing had been its own kind of work. The first genuine warmth came in the second week of April. Not a warm day, but a warm afternoon, the sun reaching an angle and an intensity that made standing on the south slope of the hill with your coat unbuttoned feel for the first time in months like something other than endurance. Clara stood outside the front wall and felt the sun on her face and looked out across the basin where the snowpack was retreating from the lower elevations, the brown and olive of grass and sage emerging in irregular patches as the white pulled back. The creek ice had broken 2 days before with a sound like a slow collapse, and the water was running high and gray with snowmelt. Edwin Marsh rode by on the road below the hill. He saw her standing outside and raised one hand, not a wave, exactly more the gesture of acknowledgement that people exchange when proximity makes acknowledgement appropriate, but distance makes conversation impractical. Clara raised her hand in return. He rode on. She watched him go and thought about the morning in December when he had pressed his hand against her north wall and stood with the wordless recognition of a man whose framework was adjusting. She thought about the berm along his cabin's north wall, which she could see from the slope on clear days, the brown earth packed against the gray timber, looking purposeful rather than accidental, looking like a decision. She went inside and brought out the stool and sat outside in the April sun with Thomas's notebook on her knee open to a blank page. She wrote the date and then a temperature reading she had taken that morning inside the room, 51 degrees, without a fire in the second week of April. The room's baseline was climbing now as the season turned the earth above and around it, beginning to absorb the spring sun's increasing warmth, banking it slowly in the same thermal mass that had been releasing it all winter. The cycle was beginning again. The room would spend the summer accumulating what it would spend the winter releasing. It would not require her attention. It would not require management or fuel or the sustained effort of someone fighting a condition. It would simply continue doing what the earth does, which is remember. She looked at what she had written, the date, the temperature, the notation about the firebox being cold, and then she turned back through the pages to October, to the first temperature reading she had taken after moving into the completed structure. 48 degrees on a night when the outside temperature was 26. The baseline in October, the lowest point in February, the gradual recovery through March, the 51 degrees of this April morning. A record, not a record of survival. She had not been keeping score against the winter, but a record of a principle being demonstrated across a full season. The principle Thomas had explained at a kitchen table in Pennsylvania applied to a hillside in Wyoming, confirmed by 8 months of careful observation. She closed the notebook. Norman Patton had looked. Edwin Marsh had looked. Russell Crane had looked later and more reluctantly, but he had looked, and what he had seen had reorganized his drafting table and was going to reorganize come summer a hillside behind his workshop. Selby had looked and written it down and sent it to Cheyenne. The Basin had looked all of it through the instrument of one winter that had been harder than expected, and had found a woman inside a hillside, warm and well, and burning less wood in 5 months than her neighbors burned in a week. She did not think of herself as having taught anyone. She was not a teacher. She was a woman who had needed to solve a problem and had solved it by paying attention to what the earth was already doing, and the solution had been visible enough that other people who were also paying attention had seen it. That was all. That was, she thought, usually how useful things happen, not through instruction or argument or the force of one person's conviction imposed on another, but through the slow and visible accumulation of evidence that the world offers to anyone willing to actually look at it. She put the notebook in her coat pocket and stood up. The afternoon was still warm enough to work outside, and there was fencing to check on the east boundary before the ground softened further and the post began to shift. She pulled on her work gloves and picked up the wire stretcher she had left leaning against the front wall and started down the slope. Behind her, the room held its temperature. The earth held the room. The season turned as seasons do, indifferent to opinion, faithful to principle. The south window would stop admitting direct winter sun for another 7 months. The firebox would not be needed for the same span. The structure would sit in the hillside through spring and summer and fall, banking the warmth of those seasons into its walls and floor, in the deep earth surrounding it, preparing without intention or effort for the next time the cold came, which it would, which it always did. And when it came, the earth would be ready, patient and full, holding everything it had gathered against the season that would try to take it. Exactly as Clara had trusted it would on the first night she lay down in the dark and said to no one and to everything, "You were right."